evening. My name is Tony Jones. You are tuned in to The Coalition. We will be talking about local, regional, and national politics, current events, and news. In studio with me is the PO taxpayer.
Hey, Tony.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Christine is also here. Chris, good evening.
Good evening, Tony. Good evening, PO.
Great to be back here with you guys. Great to be back here behind the microphone. And, well, there is a lot to talk about, and I want to talk about this news story from our media partners, FSN News, a free speech radio network news, talking about, well, as you know, fast food workers on strike. They would like $15 an hour. Also, Walmart having some issues. Let's get to the news story, then on the other side of it, we'll talk about it a little.
New unemployment numbers released today show a slight drop in the official jobless rate to 7.3%. The larger unemployment rate, which includes those who have given up looking for work or who can find only part-time jobs, is nearly twice that at 13.7%. Labor advocates point out that many of the jobs that are being added aren't offering enough hours, benefits, or paying a living wage. But low-wage workers have been fighting back. At a Walmart in Raleigh, North Carolina, more than a dozen people carried out a Steppin' for Justice flash mob after two managers refused to accept 170,000 petitions to reinstate workers who say they were unfairly fired for their labor organizing. Raleigh was one of more than a dozen cities where labor rights groups and some Walmart workers rallied for a decent wage and the end to retaliation for those organizing for collective bargaining. FSRN takes you to two of those actions in Denver and Los Angeles in this edition of Street Beat.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
I'm here today to call on Walmart for number one to reinstate the 60 workers that they've illegally terminated and or disciplined. I am the first one to be terminated after 17 years. I'm also here to call on Walmart to pay a living wage.
We're tired of the way Walmart oppresses people, and we are pretty much intimidated into not talking on the conditions that are going on in the stores.
What was very common for me at Walmart was cutting of hours, any kind of, talking to your employer about any kind of concerns you have could be met with retribution.
If you smash the workers, you are basically smashing America. Workers, the middle class, makes this country, and we have a right to defend ourselves, for a living wage that can support us, our families, and so on.
I believe everybody should have a chance to make equal pay and equal rights. I believe that America doesn't have sweatshops.
Whether you're making $8 an hour or $80 an hour, you have the right to strike. The fact of the matter is, though, when low-wage workers are attacked, it's hard to get the resources behind them to protect them, and so I need to stand with them since they were able to show that courage. I need to respond in kind, and so I'm here to be part of that process.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, ain't gonna let.
I'm assuming that we probably all highly disagree on this topic. P.O., I'm going to kick it over to you first. What are you thinking?
Well, the first thing I always object to is the continued demonization of Walmart. Low prices. I shop at Walmart. I shop proudly at Walmart. I'm part of Walmart Nation. Tell the single mother who's living in a housing project, who is now buying milk for $2.98 a gallon, that Walmart's a terrible place, and that Walmart has brought large supermarkets to the inner city, and tell them that the people who have to buy in a bodega for twice the price, that Walmart's a terrible place. Walmart is an example of free market enterprise. And free market enterprise is what this nation craves. Free market enterprise is what brings about the realization of everyone's individual talents and maximizes them. So when I hear people use the word entitlement, when I hear people use the word we deserve, I shut right down. You deserve what you earn. You deserve what you get. I don't object to folks' right to unionize in a free market, in a non-governmental organization. That's the free market as well. However, the notion that there's an expectation of a standard of living afforded to them by a private business, it's frankly un-American.
Anybody who has, whether you're for unions or against unions, anybody who's had a crappy job understands unions. And
absolutely.
It's interesting to see that the first step would be to crack down on the potential union organizers. Chris, are you a proud Walmart shopper like our pal P.O.
I am
over
not
here?
a proud Walmart shopper. I wouldn't say that I officially boycott it, but I would say that I'm very much looking forward to Costco opening in Rhode Island, which apparently is under discussion. One of my concerns about Walmart is that part of their employee orientation involves explaining to their employees how to apply for welfare.
Right.
Walmart is being heavily subsidized in every state that it's in by the state welfare rolls. So we, the taxpayer, we may be paying lower prices in the stores, but we're paying for it out the back end through our taxes. And the national minimum wage has stagnated for years behind inflation, behind wages for higher paid workers.
See, I'm of the orientation, that's not the right word, but I am of the orientation that there, in fact, should, like most pure libertarians, should not be a minimum wage. And I know, personally, I would be embarrassed, if I needed a college kid to come up here and help me out or help me out at home, I would be embarrassed to pay what the quote-unquote minimum wage is, right? I'd give that kid $15, $20 an hour, depending on what was going on. It is really part of the problem, I think, is the minimum wage, and people really, when you say that, get up in arms. They don't really see both sides of it.
Well, the issue with the minimum wage is that it typically hurts the very people that the bleeding hearts would have it support.
I don't believe that's true.
Well, let me explain. You take your freshman course in economics. Take a local area supermarket, a local independent organization. They've got $100 a week to spend on wages, hypothetically. If the minimum wage goes up, then, quite frankly, they've got less people they can hire, less hours they can put. The only antidote to that is to either rise prices, which, of course, hurts the people in the community, or to cut workers. So there's no magic economic tide that takes place on a local level when you have an increase in wages on a very small micro level. That's the first issue. So you're potentially either cutting hours or raising prices.
Except that history doesn't really bear that out. Small incremental raises to the minimum wage haven't resulted in mass layoffs. They've resulted in slightly increased buying power among the people who need to spend money the most.
Well, I would agree with you on that, but what organizations across the country right now are not talking about small incremental rise in the minimum wage and keeping with inflation. Mm-hmm. What they're looking for is a living wage. And a living wage, what it seeks to do is draw an economic parallel between an unskilled entry-level job and a job in, say, engineering support or administrative support where one's got knowledge of working computers. They're looking for, you had the situation in the New York City fast food joints. They're looking for $15 an hour. That's simply not viable.
But it was viable 30 years ago. There's no reason why it shouldn't be viable now, except that corporations have gotten used to doing different things with their money than paying workers.
Well,
the money is there. The money is currently flowing up the chain instead of down the chain.
You may look to the profit margins of a McDonald's or a Walmart and point out that might be true.
Mm-hmm.
And I would argue that in many cases, local hiring environments, I work in the Boston area, and if I try to hire people at minimum wage, I simply won't get any phone calls.
Oh, right. And I have friends who are business owners who say the same thing.
Right. But if you look at, say, the economic black hole that is, in fact, Rhode Island, you're looking at predominantly smaller employers who a dramatic increase in labor costs will result in, quite frankly, less employees or being forced to attempt to rise prices.
Well, I know smaller employers who wouldn't dream of paying minimum wage because, as they put it, I want to attract people who are going to stick with this job for a long time.
I'd be embarrassed.
Well,
it's embarrassment. It's embarrassment, but it's also the cost of having to hire and rehire and rehire.
Right.
But you're talking about choice then, and I'm all about choice.
Yeah, but they're making the choice because it makes economic sense. They're not making the choice because someone's holding a gun to their head or just the embarrassment issue.
Absolutely.
There's it's a much more complicated issue than what you might think from Economics 101.
Right. However, if you're allowing the market to speak, in my case, I work up in the Watertown area.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I couldn't get anybody to work for $8.50 an hour or whatever it is in Massachusetts.
Right.
I have to pay quite a bit more than that
Right.
if I want to get a quality employee. That's the market speaking. I have no objection to that. However, holding the proverbial gun to the business owner's head and saying, you have to pay this, you have to do this, all right, stifles job creation and stifles small business creation. I've run a small business. I've been down that road. And,
I don't think that makes sense, though. I mean, you're saying yourself that you need to pay more in order to attract quality workers.
If you're in an environment which is economically growing. Rhode Island, I mean, again, in Massachusetts, you're able to increase prices on certain goods and products because you've got a growing economy. That growing economy is not a function at all of what entry-level jobs are being created. That's just a kind of a tag-along process. However, if you're in an environment like the Attleborough or Cumberland, Rhode Island, or the Bucket, or here in La Prave, right, where there simply are no jobs. I mean, look at what happened to high school kids the last 2 summers. There just simply are no jobs. If you then turn to someone who can barely afford to hire someone in the first place and say you have to pay more than they can afford, there's no there.
Well, the part of the issue is, too, the cost of hiring and firing. Now, someone's working for minimum wage, so chances are they're working there until they can get a better job.
Right.
Right? But it has cost you all this money just to get the person in the door, especially someone that has drug tests and background checks, BCIs. Now, that kid, or maybe it's not even a kid, they have just spent a short time there, and they're looking to move on to another job, so now you're back in the hole, where if you could attract any kind of decent workers by offering a little bit more, I think that a large amount of your companies are going to do that anyway, and the ones that aren't going to have any decent employees.
Well, I think it depends on, maybe there should be different regulations for different size businesses, because a business like Walmart, they're the 900-pound gorilla in the room. They can set policy for the rest of the country simply because of their size, and I'm not sure that necessarily...
But let me debate that for a second.
Okay.
You brought up Costco. Costco is an organization that's well known for being a progressive workplace, paying above minimum wage for entry-level jobs, and is beginning to take a chunk out of Walmart's pie. You see, that, to me, is a natural evolution, because that is the marketplace.
Okay.
Costco has found both the management talent, the capital, and the product base to do the right thing.
Right.
They're doing the right thing, though, because it makes good business sense. They're not doing the quote-unquote right thing because government is telling them they have to do it.
But
that's what I object to.
But government is currently supporting Walmart's practices.
Walmart is, to see, in my mind...
We are paying taxes to support employees who are not being paid sufficiently by Walmart.
But isn't that part and parcel of the same problem? You've got government effectively trying to structure the socio-economic workplace. It's a planning, almost socialistic environment. When you do that, it ultimately will fail. And,
I'm not following that.
All right, here's the issue in America today, the bigger picture. In America, businesses are not allowed to live and die based on the quality of their product, what they sell the product for, the talent, the integrity of the company.
That's tendentious, but go ahead.
Businesses are structured from the get-go according to tax policy, healthcare policy, social policy in the forms of the 10-cent living wage. In other parts of the world, businesses win or lose based on their product, what they sell it for, and how good they do a job of it.
But part of that's because many of those other countries have extreme social networks compared to what we have. Nationalized healthcare. Not necessarily, but often.
Well,
Germany has a very strong social network. German companies are thriving. Their economy is doing well. I'm not going to claim that every country with a strong social network has that in place, but to some extent you're comparing apples and oranges.